We have seven papers in all. The first four, all of them addressing one topic or the other concerning teacher education. And the first presentation is by Avinash Kumar, titled Philosophy of Education and Teacher Education Syllabi in India. Avinash is pursuing his master's degree at Azim Premji University. It should be followed by Professor Dina Kule's Perspectives on Initial Teacher Education in Germany, Structure of IT, Legal Context, and the Rationale of the Teaching Profession. And she's a professor in the Department of Educational Sciences, Humboldt University, Berlin. The third paper is titled Theory and Apprenticeship in Teacher Education. It's by Professor Christopher Winch, who is Professor of Education and Professional Studies at King's College London. And the fourth one by Professor Rohit Dhankar, titled Teacher Education, Foundational versus Integrated Approaches. And Professor Dhankar teaches at Azim Premji University. And this session will be chaired by Professor Vijay Verma. And may I have all of you on this?
Good morning. My name is Avinash Kumar. I am a student at the Azim Premji University Masters of Education program. The paper that I'm going to present is titled Philosophy of Education in Teacher Education Syllabi in India. It has often been argued that the ability to think philosophically is indispensable to a teacher's capacity for professional judgment. It has also been stressed that this ability is not something that prospective teachers can necessarily and easily learn by the light of nature, but one which they may develop with the assistance of others who are skilled at it. Further, the central role of teachers' competence in achieving the educational and thus the social, economic, and other objectives of the nation, and that of teacher education in developing teacher competence, too, is now commonly acknowledged, as can be seen by this excerpt from the National Curriculum Framework of Teacher Education 2010, which is a policy document of India. The importance of competent teachers to the nation's school system cannot be overemphasized, it says. The academic and professional standards of teachers constitute a critical component of the essential learning conditions for achieving the educational goals and the larger process of social transformation. Initial teacher education, it goes on to say, has a major part to play in the making of a teacher. It marks the initiation and has tremendous potential to imbue the would-be teacher with the aspirations, knowledge-based repertoire of pedagogic capacities and human attitudes. In this paper, therefore, I intend to investigate and attempt to answer three primary questions. First, what is the position of philosophy of education in the syllabi of teacher education programs in India? Second, is the way philosophy of education presently conceived and taught in teacher education most conducive to the goal of developing teachers as required by National Curriculum Framework 2005 and envisioned in the National Curriculum Framework for Teacher Education 2010? And third, can a reconception of philosophy of education in teacher education in India and a realignment of its contents and methods assist in making teacher education more effective? In line with the above objectives, this paper is divided into 4 sections. In section 1, I'll begin by presenting the results of a sample survey of the syllabi of a Bachelor of Education programs offered by 11 Indian universities. The focus of the presentation, expectedly, will be on ascertaining the place of philosophy of education in these syllabi and on highlighting A, their main components, and B, the relative emphasis placed on the components. Through the analysis, I'll also attempt to bring attention to the emerging outlines of the dominant conception of philosophy of education in Indian teacher education. In section 2, I'll present a brief historical survey of the field of philosophy of education, focusing especially on the rise of the new school of philosophy of education in the 1950s and 60s, and its critique of the traditional approach. In the process, I'll attempt to outline the essential features of both approaches and show how philosophy of education in Indian teacher education is still more closely aligned with the traditional approach. In the third section, I'll discuss some key characteristics of teachers as envisioned in NCF 2005 and NCFT 2010, and then present the views of some philosophers of education of the broadly conceived analytical tradition on teachers and teaching, showing the close congruence between the two. Finally, in section 4, I'll sum up the discussion and conclude by suggesting that a reconception of philosophy of education in Indian teacher education that allows for an incorporation of certain features of the broadly conceived analytical tradition may better serve the needs and objectives of the Indian teacher education. So now moving on to the first section, which is titled Philosophy of Education in Indian Teacher Education, the Present Scenario. I must forewarn you that in this section there are certain graphs and numbers perhaps not something that you'd expect in a philosophy conference, but I just thought it's easiest to share this information in form of graphs, and therefore I request you to please bear with me for a few slides. I'll come back to the bullet points in a while. The primary objective of the sample survey, which was done in second quarter of 2012, was to help gauge the place of philosophy of education in teacher education syllabi of Indian universities. A list of 20 universities which offer one-year Bachelor of Education programs was first drawn using the broad criteria that the sample universities should represent all geographic regions as well as a good mix of good and average universities based on the NAAC ratings. The next step was to obtain the B.Ed syllabi of these universities and to assess if these were comprehensive enough to allow their detailed comparison based on some key parameters such as the number of courses, content topics, number of class hours, credits per course, and so on. After applying these criteria, the initial list was narrowed down to 11 universities, as has been listed on the screen right now. Now, I know this audience has a mix of people who are intimately familiar with the teacher education scene in India, and some of you may not be so familiar. So just in case this appears Greek and Latin to you, don't worry. The details aren't all that important to my central thesis. But I just wanted to show you the kind of universities and that it has a mix of what the NAAC considers to be good and average universities. All teachers in India do not undergo the same education. Various programs such as Bachelor in Elementary Education, Diploma in Education, Bachelor in Physical Education, etc. are available for prospective teachers to choose from. However, given that a significant number choose the one-year B.Ed program, in this paper I'll limit my discussion to the syllabi of one-year Bachelor of Education program. Further, to contextualize the analysis that follows, it would be relevant to make three preliminary points about these programs. First, although the official duration of the course is taken as 1 year, it usually comprises of about 210 working days. Of these, about 30 days are spent in student admissions, examinations, and non-academic work, and thus about 180 working days are available for instruction and work experiences. In the syllabi that were studied, the actual number of days planned prescribed for instruction varied from 210, which roughly works to about 180 working hours, to 155 days, works out to 930 work hours. However, most universities seem to recommend about 180 days of instructions. That's about 6 months of working days, is all that many teachers in our country train for. That's the duration that they usually train for. Second, these 180 working days are further divided into days for theory instructions and days for practical work, as they're calling it, which includes the internship. The ratio of the two in the syllabi examined varies from 70 theory to 30 practical to 50 theory and 50 practical. And third, the number of theory courses range between 6 and 10, but are often 7. Further, these courses may be named variously and may have varying content, but they often have a common core, as is listed on the screen right now. Typically, you may not find the exact names on the syllabi, but you'll very typically find 4 core courses. The first one that you see listed, which I've called the Foundations of Education and Contemporary Issues. This is where generally the philosophy and sociology related portion, so as to say, as I mentioned it in the syllabi, is included. Psychology usually is a separate course. There's one on school education management. And the fourth one is broadly a history of education, development of secondary or primary education in India. And then there are a couple of pedagogy courses that the students can choose from. So this could vary between science, physics, depending on the universities that you're studying at. So now I move on to the presentation of the result and analysis of this very brief survey. To gauge the position of philosophy of education in the syllabi studied, I attempted to seek answers for 3 questions in the survey, which are enumerated below. Does the syllabus contain any topics classified under the heading of philosophy as per the syllabi, and or does it contain any topics which people associated with the field of teacher education in India generally consider to be related to philosophy of education? If yes, what is the number of class hours and credits allotted to the teaching or class-based discussions of these topics? And third, what is the content of the PoE part of the syllabus? That is, what topics are being included in the syllabi? I'll present the findings and the analysis in the same order. First, topics related to philosophy are included in all 11 syllabi that were studied. However, except in Mumbai University, philosophy is not studied as a separate course. In some programs, it forms part of the philosophical and sociological foundations of education course, while more often it is included as a few units within one of the courses that's typically named Education in Emerging Indian Society. Second, the average or the mean number of hours allotted to philosophy, whether as a separate course or as a few units of a given course, is about 40. The actual number of hours allotted in each university, however, shows substantial variation, from 16 hours in Osmania University to about 58 hours in Maharishi Dayanand University. So there are many teachers in the country who might get as less as 16 hours, or on average about 40 hours of philosophical training, formal philosophical training. If one were to present the number of hours allotted to philosophy as a percentage of the total working hours in the corresponding B.Ed course, the average percentage comes to about 3.7%, and the range varies from 1.5% to 5.6%. So if it's 1,000 hours we are talking about, that's the numbers that we're about 15 to 56, roughly. Let us now turn to the third question, which was the question that I personally was most interested in. What are the topics that are included in the philosophy course or units in these syllabi? Moreover, based on the time allotted to the topics and the frequency of inclusion in different syllabi, can we begin to ascertain the areas of emphasis in, and thus the contours of, philosophy of education in Indian teacher education? I must note here, however, that presenting every philosophy-related topic covered in all 11 syllabi would have perhaps neither been possible nor very useful for the main objective of this paper. The focus would thus be on those topics which are included most often and/or tend to be allotted a relatively higher proportion of instruction time. Additionally, I'll highlight some topics which are rarely included in the B.Ed syllabi, but the relevance of including these topics might become clearer in the subsequent sections. The topics which are included in most syllabi are as follows, listed in the order of the frequency of the inclusion: meaning and nature of education, aims, goals of education, educational implications of the following schools of thought: idealism, naturalism, realism, pragmatism. Educational contributions of great thinkers such as Gandhi, Tagore, Aurobindo, Dewey, etc. The first two topics, I might note here, tend to be allotted lesser time, whereas the third and fourth topic, educational implications and educational contributions, pack much more content. Moreover, while the time spent on individual topics was not available for all the syllabi that I studied, at least in 3 universities, Osmania, Devi Ahilya, and Lucknow University, the latter two topics seem to take close to 3/4 of the total time allotted to philosophy. In contrast, however, Mumbai University allots these topics about 1/4 of the total time. Some details. Okay, so now on the other end of the spectrum, some topics which find only a few or rare inclusions are analysis of fundamental educational concepts, role of teachers as reflective practitioners, analysis of Indian and Western thinkers, significance of studying philosophy and understanding educational practices and problems. These are covered in 1 or 2 syllabi of the 11 that I studied. The next slide might seem a little dense, and I don't expect you to be able to actually read it. The only reason I have included it so that you just know how I've gone about doing it and the kind of details that are available in case you'd be interested in taking a look. So the topmost part is the one that's most often included. As I've already mentioned, these include topics like aims and goals of education, educational contributions of some certain schools of thought, the contributions of certain great thinkers and implications of certain schools of thought. The middle one is the moderately frequent, that's the meaning, nature of philosophy, relationship between philosophy and education, Vedanta, Buddhism, Jainism, Sankhya, philosophy, and so on. And the ones that are least frequently included, I've already mentioned a few. Okay, so to sum up our discussion till now, I'm coming towards the end of the first section. We started by looking at some of the general features of the one-year B.Ed programs, which include 180 working days, time division between theory and practical work, which varies between 50-50 and 70-30 in favor of theory, and some common core courses across the B.Ed syllabi. Then we saw how topics related to philosophy are included in all sample syllabi, but under different courses, and that the overall time allotted to philosophy on average is about 40 hours, which is little less than 4% of the overall work hours. Finally, I highlighted some of the most frequently included and emphasized topics in the philosophy of education syllabi, and contrasted these with some topics which rarely find a mention. But what is philosophy of education, and what, if any, is its role in teacher education? It's to these questions that I have left unanswered till now that I'll turn my attention to in the next section. Presenting a brief historical survey of the field, very brief in fact, I'll attempt to highlight the early contested nature of the philosophy of education and the essential characteristics of both traditional and analytical approach. With this, I also hope to, 1, show that the philosophy of education in Indian teacher education still aligns more closely with what's been called the traditional approach and underscore some of its limitations. One of the earliest formal associations in the field of philosophy of education was the Philosophy of Education Society, which was formed in the United States in the year 1941. The definition of philosophy of education, its methods, as well as its approach, however, remained contested in the initial decades. In the United States, and also to some extent in England in the 50s and 60s, Nordembo notes there was a widespread tendency in educational discussions to advance some kind of philosophical system and then later examine whatever implications the different philosophical positions might have on education. The pattern of thought was to deduce educational conclusions from the most basic positions of logic, metaphysics, and ethics. This deductivism, however, met with widespread criticism, one of the earliest of which was by Hooke, who claimed that, I quote, to encourage philosophers to derive a philosophy of education from some philosophical positions such as idealism, realism, Thomism, existentialism, etc., is to encourage them to perpetuate garrulous absurdities, unquote. A spate of articles arguing both for and against this approach followed. However, one of the strongest criticism of what was called the traditional method of teaching philosophy of education was raised by Macmillan in a symposium of American Philosophical Association in 1962, when he began with the claim, I quote, I submit that the chief deterrent to the advancement of philosophy of education is the obstinate assumption that from different metaphysical premises, different educational systems and methods should be logically derived. And then went on to argue that this approach led to trivialities or to nonsense. He acceded that the prospective teachers may be taught the different philosophical positions for the sake of knowing about them, but argued that this would seem to miss much of the point, as their interest in the matter are essentially practical. His criticism, though, was directed at philosophy of education as it was carried on at the time, and he remained hopeful that it could be made more relevant to educational needs and challenges. A glance around, he says, reveals any number of concrete and important problems relating to the task of education that need the most serious attention of those who possess the wisdom and analytical skills that the pursuit of philosophy should cultivate, and who recognize the social responsibility of philosophy. Responding to Macmillan's criticism, Smith in 1962 sought to clarify that the term philosophy of education is used in at least 4 different senses, to refer to a way of thinking about educational questions or discourses which corresponds with the way that the philosophers would think about them, to refer to the product of philosophical way of thinking about educational questions, say Dewey's work on education, to refer to analysis of concepts related to education, and to refer to courses in which philosophy of education in any of the above 3 is studied. Agreeing with Macmillan that philosophy is relevant and important to education, he outlined 5 educational tasks that cannot be performed adequately without a knowledge of philosophy, according to him. Instruction, giving direction to the overall educational enterprise, development of educational programs, clarification of educational concepts, and the examination and resolution of educational problems with respect to the philosophical issues involved. Instruction, one of the central and everyday concern of teachers, he stressed, was grounded in the operations and rules of logic. One of the significant contributors to this then new approach to philosophy of education was Israel Scheffler, whose contributions went a long way to establish philosophy of education as a legitimate branch of philosophy. Early on in his work, he too expressed impatience with any approach to philosophy of education which attempted to derive implications for education from general and philosophical positions, and held that the main objective of philosophy of education is, I quote, is to improve our philosophical understanding of educational issues, unquote. On the other side of the Atlantic, a similar role was being played by Richard Peters in Britain. The content being taught in teacher training colleges and university departments in the country at the time as philosophy was, I quote, little more than historical study of the contribution of educational thought of a selection of philosophers from Plato to Dewey, unquote. It was both dissociated with analytical turn in the larger field of philosophy and divorced from the contemporary educational issues. In Education and Education of Teachers, Peter notes, I quote, many philosophers are now turning with sharper and more highly polished tools to problems in education. They are thus rather aghast when they encounter what is often called philosophy of education, with its chatter about growth, wholeness, and even more aghast when they learn that students from very often are brought up on antiquated diet of Plato, Rousseau, Froebel. It is as if a course on educational psychology consisted mainly in snippets from Aristotle, Locke, James Mill, and others. The important changes that was brought about by this school can perhaps be summed by Ham's account on philosophy of education. In a chapter titled The Nature of Philosophical Inquiry into Educational Discourse, he starts by noting that 1, philosophy of education is not synonymous with educational theory. Philosophy of education also is not a study of the history of educational thought, and philosophy of education is not a matter of drawing conclusions, making extrapolations, and eliciting implications from bodies of systematic and doctrinaire thought of metaphysical, sociopolitical, or religious nature. Turning to the question of what philosophy of education is, he then suggests that to answer this question, we must understand what philosophers of education do. when they philosophize, and proposes that they ask and try to answer 3 types of questions. What do you or a given word or concept mean? How do you know? That is, what are the grounds for the claim of knowing something? And what is presupposed? That is, what assumptions does a claim or proposal, etc., rely on? It is when one acquires the habit of asking these questions about one's own and others' speech and writing about education, he concludes that one begins to be a philosopher of education. Based on a very brief discussion in this section and findings of the survey I presented in section 1, the philosophy of education in Indian B.Ed syllabi clearly seems to be more closely aligned with the traditional approach. This section's discussion also, I hope, brings to fore some of the limitations of such an approach, such as the extremely tenuous link between philosophical positions and educational implications drawn from them, and the fact that what thinkers have said about education may well be their ideals and prescriptions rather than philosophically considered views. I'm moving to the next section, which is teaching and teachers as envisioned in National Curriculum Framework and National Curriculum Framework for Teacher Education. This section is actually divided into 2 subsections. I'll present in the first some of the important characteristics of teachers as required by NCF and NCFT E 2010. Thereafter, in the second subsection, I'll present some views of some philosophers of education of the broadly conceived analytical tradition on teachers and teaching. And my attempt would be to show the congruence in these 2 views, and I hope to underline the relevance of the analytical approach for Indian teacher education through this. Expressing concern about the state of teacher curriculum and its effect on the larger educational goals of the country, the National Curriculum Framework 2005 points out, teacher education programs today, I quote, teachers' education programs today train teachers to adjust to a system in which education is seen as a transmission of information. Knowledge is treated as given, embedded in curriculum, and accepted without question. Curriculum, syllabi, and textbooks are never critically examined by the student teacher. Further, it goes on to say that most teacher education programs provide little scope for student teachers to examine their own biases and beliefs and reflect on their own experiences as part of classroom discourse and inquiry, thus failing to empower them as change agents. The NCF also expects a teacher to be a facilitator of children's learning in a manner that helps children to construct knowledge and meaning, offers the possibility of teachers to participate in the construction of syllabi, textbooks, and teaching learning materials, and stresses on not just developing the children's capabilities of becoming autonomous, but also the teacher's autonomy and choice. Commenting on the observations of teacher education in NCF 2005, the NCFT 2010 says, I quote, we have realized the tentative and fluid nature of the knowledge base of teacher education. This makes reflective practice the central aim of teacher education. It needs to build capacities in teachers to discern and judge in moments of uncertainty and fluidity. It should also engage teachers with the curriculum, syllabi, and textbooks to critically examine them rather than taking them as given and accepted without questions. There are, of course, several such examples in these 2 documents, some of which you see on the screen right now. In fact, I ran a check and given my quantitative sort of predilections, the term professional has been used in association with teachers for over 150 times in this document. NCFT, just one. Reflections, reflective, etc. has been used over 80 times, and critical in its various forms, critical thinking, critical reading, etc. has been used over 50 times. Not that that in itself proves anything, but for a document that is about 103 pages, the fact that there is over 200 mentions of these 3 terms gives you some sense of how central these are, the kind of emphasis that the NCFT lays on these. Based on the preceding discussions, one could argue that there are at least 3 clear interrelated expectations from the teachers envisioned in NCF and NCFT, among others. And they can be, so that was another set of quotes that I had, reflections and reflective and critical thinking and so on. So the 3 characteristics that really stand out among others, but these are, I think, some of the central ones in these policy documents, are that one, the teachers should be trained such that they are capable of, rather educated, such that they're capable of autonomously performing their function as teachers, that they're critical thinkers, and that they're reflective practitioners. Furthermore, the fact that we are a democratic society and the student teachers are expected to play a significant role in the education of children who, at some point in the future, would take on the responsibilities that comes with being a citizen of a democratic society, it can be argued, makes these characteristics of teachers especially relevant and important for Indian teacher education, as also the teacher education of other democratic societies. As Apple and Bean stress in democratic schools, I quote, if we wanted our school to be a place where all kids could be active participants in a democratic culture, we would have to structure a program where all teachers could be too. We would have to encourage teachers to unearth the reasons beneath their current practices and to reconsider that practice in the light of changing economic and social realities. In other words, we have to respect and make room for them as thinkers as well as doers. The idea of teachers as autonomous individuals capable of reflection and critical thinking, thus, is not just central to the professional success and therefore also to the larger educational objectives of the country, but also deeply interconnected with ideas of producing ideal citizens for a democracy, as the NCF 2005 acknowledges clearly at various points. Moving to the second subsection of this section. In this subsection, I'll present how some philosophers of education of broadly conceived analytical tradition have viewed teachers and teaching, and my attempt will be to show the similarities in the views in the last section. One of the central figures of the analytical tradition of philosophy of education, Scheffler saw teachers as, I quote, free men and women with special dedication to the values of the intellect and the enhancement of critical powers of the young, and viewed teaching as being practiced, I quote, in such manner as to respect the student's intellectual integrity, capacity for independent judgment, unquote. Thus, teaching in his view is not the same as acculturation, using one-way monologues, but something deeply associated with critical dialogue between participants and aiming for intellectual independence of the student. As here points out, Scheffler wishes to see teacher as not someone who passively receives philosophical wisdom dispensed by experts, but someone actively engaged in rational reflection and arguments and assumptions in the context of education. This, expectedly, is connected with his deeply held belief that philosophical analysis offers prospective teachers not primarily a body of substantive doctrine, but rather a wide variety of methods and procedures which can be used to construct one's educational views. Peterson, on similar lines, notes that education in complex societies no longer have agreed aims. Fundamental questions, for instance, around school organization, morality and moral questions, class management and curriculum are often raised. Moreover, unlike the theories of the sciences, educational theories often are not universally agreed upon often, and most questions of educational policy in practice would involve a mix of value judgment and forms of empirical inquiry. Furthermore, education is also increasingly an issue of public concern and scrutiny, and teachers can no longer depend merely on received wisdom or common sense. Thus, if they are to retain their position as professionals with any form of authority, he argues, they have to learn to think rigorously for themselves and hold their own in the welter of public discussion. Similarly, Winch sees expertise in teaching as requiring a capacity for independent and collective judgment, as well as substantial measure of autonomy based on sound conceptual understanding of education. He has thus stressed that the need to provide prospective teachers with a framework for independent thinking and problem solving. The ability to recognize the contestability of educational concepts, such as assessments and aims, he believes, is necessary to be able to even, I quote, adequately grasp them, let alone be able to use them to form professional judgments, unquote. To sum up, it's no longer a question of whether a teacher indulges in reflection about her theory or practice, but whether she does it well or poorly. But how is a prospective teacher to learn to think rigorously? Which is central to her autonomy and professional success? Prospective teachers, as Peters argued, cannot begin to think in a rigorous, differentiated way without being given the conceptual tools and without the forms of arguments being articulated for them by one well-versed in this mode of thinking or form of thought, so that they can gradually pick it up. People do not learn precision of thought by the light of nature. They have to be taught it by one who is skilled at it. It is here that inculcation of some general abilities, such as construction and assessment of different types of arguments, justification and inferences on pertinent contemporary issues, policies and practices, unveiling an examination of assumptions, positing and explaining distinctions, open-mindedness and willingness to engage in rational deliberations, discourse and decision-making, conceptual and logical analysis and clarity, as much in thought as in expression, can play a central role in the development of professionally autonomous, rigorously reflective, and socially aware teachers, by equipping them with the tools of disciplined philosophical thought right at the level of their initial education, and then gradually transforming their way of engaging with educational issues and the society at large. I come to the final part of my presentation. I'll just sum up my discussion and and then conclude. I began by asking 3 questions. What is the position of philosophy of education in the syllabi of teacher education, of B.Ed programs in India? Is the way philosophy of education presently conceived and taught in teacher programs most conducive to the goal of developing teachers as envisioned in NCF 2005 and NCFT 2010? And given this vision of teachers, can a reconception of philosophy of education in Indian teacher education and a realignment of its contents and methods assist in making teacher education more effective? In section 1, we saw that, I discussed that though philosophy is included in all the sample syllabi studied, there are at least 2 important areas of concern. 1, the average time spent on the instruction classroom discussion in philosophy of education is only about 40 hours. And in many universities, it can be as less as 16 hours. While one accedes that the main concern should not be the allocation of time allotted to one subject over the other, given that for many prospective teachers, this may well be their first and last formal training in philosophy of education, one cannot help wonder about the adequacy of the allotted instruction time. Second, the emphasis of most philosophy of educational course seem clearly on 4 or 5 topics that involve descriptive studies as opposed to analytical, critical thinking about issues, and studying about educational implications of philosophical positions and educational contributions of well-regarded thinkers seem to be the central focus of most courses. This suggests that the traditional conception of philosophy of education may still dominate philosophy of education in India, in teacher education. In the second section, I presented some of the critiques of the traditional approach, noting among others Macnaran's arguments that attempt to draw educational implications from philosophical position leads to quote-unquote trivialities, and Ham's account on the lines that the thoughts and contributions of thinkers are often just statements of individuals' ideals in education and favorite prescriptions for child rearing and not necessarily philosophical. I further noted that the attempt to reconceptualize philosophy of education as primarily a way of thinking about educational questions and issues, and how it saw philosophical analysis as offering a wide variety of methods and procedures as opposed to doctrines that could be used to construct one's own educational views. In the third section, I then emphasized the importance of the conception of philosophy of education to teacher education by A, highlighting the professional autonomy, which is contingent on one's ability to reflect and think critically for it to be meaningful, and B, that development of these key abilities among prospective teachers is also one of the central concerns of the broadly conceived analytical tradition. In closing, I would like to emphasize that my claim is not that there is no value in reading about the thoughts of educational thinkers past or present. The question I have attempted to raise is, given the constraints such as the extremely limited instruction time, as well as the objectives of the teacher education in the contemporary society, whether we think this is the best approach. My submission is that instead of starting with the question, who are some of the most important educational thinkers, or what are the important philosophical positions, and then moving to books on their theories, doctrines, or thoughts, which I'm calling the thinker-centered model, may it be better to start with the question, how do we develop prospective teachers' ability to think philosophically, and then move to help them use the nascent abilities to reflect or discuss on contemporary educational issues and challenges with the larger objective of developing their professional autonomy. That is, which I'm calling the thinking-centered model. I hope that I have been able to convince you that there may be a case for reconception of philosophy of education so that it better serves the objectives of the Indian teacher education and thus also the broader educational objectives of this nation. Thank you.
Being so prompt in your presentation, can we now invite questions from the floor? We have 20 minutes for that.
I really need to congratulate you for a wonderful analysis. You have made a convincing case, a very, very strong case why it should be reconceptualized. I just had 2 little comments. One was, like, when you posed 3 central questions of philosophy by some thinker, means the thinker, right. But I did not say what should be the normative questions, what should be in education. How do we know, what do we know, and what are the presumptions? But along with that, what should be there in education? That is another very central question. 2 is, I did not say epistemology in general, but
I can hear you actually, so you could.
Discipline-specific epistemology appearing anywhere. So that was a little point I thought could also be included under philosophy of education. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's there are just so many pressures playing around when you consider what should go in and out. And I completely take your point that, the things that I've suggested is certainly not exhaustive. But as I was saying, the total number of working days is 6 months. So, that sometimes does make me wonder that the issue is much larger, really. And I know NCFT has, in fact, recommended that the duration itself be increased. But yes.
Question from there.
Avinash, this is just a comment to that speaker.
Sure.
The very 3 questions of what do you mean, how do you know, and what is presupposed is essentially epistemology. So we don't require, once if you learn epistemology, you don't require subject-specific epistemology. Epistemology is only one. So that's one thing. Also, as you rightly point out, the philosophology or many of the traditional thinkers, when you just derive from philosophies, they lead to contradictions. So, as you rightly point out, what you need to know is that basically the manner in which you think, how to critically analyze, and what is really presupposed.
Right. I'm taking that as a comment, not a question. Not really. I think it was more of a comment. I don't really have to say.
Something on the same lines. So my experience has been that this whole issue of reflective practice is crucially dependent on not only being familiar with the sort of methodology, but also that it has to be embedded in a good knowledge base in at least one of the related disciplines. And most of our teachers unfortunately lack in that. Our education faculties assume that the bachelor's degree that they come with would have given them that base, but we know that that doesn't happen.
Right.
And there's also the question of, when our aim is to train them in reflective practice, can we at least try and connect the bridges between knowledge base of a discipline and the method of reflective practice as part of the training, and at least give them a sense that in order to become a good reflective practitioner, they'll probably have to exert to improve their knowledge base in at least one selected discipline. It could be the subject that they're teaching or some other related subject. Unfortunately, this emphasis I find is missing in both NCFT and also NCF has some inklings of this, and I find great resistance. Great resistance in education is to this idea, because the faculties themselves, unfortunately, at times don't have their own knowledge base strong enough.
Right. Back, it's been a few months since I wrote this, and since then I have tried to sort of broaden my inquiry a little bit. So one way I've done that is, of course, as you'd expect, increase the number of syllabi that I've studied. So that's gone up to 20 now. The pattern that emerges hasn't really changed much, except one university, the Delhi University, which you see a very clear sort of tilt away from the mainstream. The second thing that I've also been doing is, talking to teachers and teacher educators and so on, just to get a finer grip on what exactly is happening within the classrooms. In some ways, I was surprised that many of the teacher educators, in fact, it didn't come as it would not, but it didn't come as a surprise to them at all. But which is itself wasn't very surprising. But what was surprising was that they wanted a change. Of the few that I have spoken with, the numbers aren't really large. So I'm not exactly sure at this stage. It is a systemic issue more or less. It's not something that perhaps could be addressed by addressing one small thing, but yes, there are views even among teacher educators who would be, I believe would be supporting it, but then of course, as you're saying, there are other sections as well who might not support it all that much. So.
Okay. Somebody already has a microphone. Yes, can you start, and then Abhijit after you?
These, I must say, are required. They give a good overview as to what is being, and ranges are being worked on. It was needed. I myself wanted to.
I'm missing some of your words.
I think if you could speak directly.
I haven't said anything very significant. The point I want to make is I'm taking DLED and BEd courses,
Right.
and I always feel short of time to make them into critical thinkers and reflective thinkers. It really takes a long process. But when you study and say that 4% of the overall time is instruction time, somewhere probably you're assuming that reflective thinking and these abilities are done only during instruction hours. In fact, without the practice, it is simply not possible. So even the practice time is part of this. It's an ongoing process. It's not divided into theory and practice, right?
Yeah.
I just want to make that
Yeah,
point.
sure. Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm sorry, just 1 second. So the instruction time, or now I hesitate to show this to you because it's still work in progress. I haven't completely, sort of come to a conclusion of that. But I was saying I have spoken with some of the teachers, and my main concern, you see, is that to many of them, or at least to the ones that I have spoken with till now, it's almost that they're equating philosophy of education. You know, when we say philosophy of education, the thing that comes to their mind is just the history of educational thought. Or at least that's the most strongest association. I'm not saying that that's the only thing, you know, but to many people, that's the strongest association right now. Yes, of course, you know, it's not that just that 4-5% of the, you know, instruction time. That's not the only time that you know, I'm not even suggesting, you know, that that's the only time that you'd be using or even practicing that. But my basic argument is that in that time, there are certain things that can be taught in a structured manner, which can help them even, you know, in the other, while they are engaged in practice and so on and so forth. So some of the things that I had, I'm sorry, just give me a moment. Some of the things that I had listed here, these could be taught in a structured manner, I believe, which is missing right now. Yes.
Okay, question, Abhijit. Would you like to take? And keep my plea, keep it short, because I see a lot of hands.
Sure. Now, I just wanted to make a small comment rather, is that while I entirely agree with you that philosophy of education courses have to culminate into students who are thinkers and autonomous thinkers, so I entirely agree with you, but I mean, but probably we should remember, or I would think that, or I would propose that that should be the kind of culmination and not the beginning, because unless students learn some of the best examples of critical thinking and how critical thinking is applied to educational issues, that means some of the best examples of the philosophical thought in action, that means some of the best thinkers and how they have thought, probably it will be difficult to kind of learn how the best philosophy. So that's of course these two things are complementary, but I just wanted to bring it to
So I just want to value in studying about what people have had to say about education at all. I do think that there is value, and there's a lot of value in that. But it's just that given the constraints that we're working under, given the time that the very short duration of time that we have, and so on and so forth, is that the best approach is something that I'm not very sure of. I mean, imagine. And as all analogies, it's not going to be a perfect analogy. You can punch holes in that as well. But the basic thing, like imagine that you were in charge of a society of 10,000 people, and let's say that you were in charge of training people for a certain other profession, right? And we are considering teaching a profession. Let's say medicine. You're in charge of sort of educating physicians, and you had very limited time, right? What would your first preference be? I don't know what your opinion would be, but I would be very hesitant if I spent most of my time just telling them about physicians from ancient Greece. And by that I do not mean, again I'm saying there is value. I'm not saying that there is no value. There is value in studying about them. But it's just that a matter of priority. If I have to choose in that limited time, I would rather that I spend that time in helping them practice than learning about what physicians in Greece or Egypt or India had to say. But then again, I do agree that these are complementary. It's not that if you study about them, you cannot learn anything about critical thinking at all. But it's just a matter of emphasis, I think, and focus.
Right. Lest I be accused of privileging the left-hand side of the hall, can we take some questions from the right?
Finding your whole position is kind of rooted in a philosophical orthodoxy, and you cannot excuse yourself with a managerial explanation that you may not have enough time, and therefore maybe that's why we already decide and pick what we basically like for ourselves as a method of philosophizing. So I feel that it is to do justice to this issue that you have raised, you must allow that those who teach philosophy of education other ways may have good reasons to do it. And I feel there is a certain amount of prejudgment with which you have viewed these curricula. I feel it would be more valid if you actually talked to those who teach philosophy of education in other ways and try to understand how they achieve what is valuable through it. Let's not presume that everybody reduces the syllabus to rote learning. There may be something educationally valuable which committed teacher educators think that they're realizing through what they're doing. So I would strongly argue that in order to proceed with this analysis, you have to have a much more grounded approach to the way in which different people choose and treat the teacher education curriculum. That's one point. The second point is if what we are after is really critical, reflective thinking, then why do we believe that philosophy of education is somehow privileged as a way of accessing or achieving that? In fact, I think it's quite possible that this kind of criticality that we are after within teacher education can be achieved through many routes of inquiry, and philosophy is one of them. So would you, by that measure, be willing to give up some privilege for philosophy in this entire business of reflective teaching?
So we have a brief answer from you as well.
Answer. Yeah. Okay. So I'll take the first question first, and then I'll come to the second one. I completely take it that it's at best a preliminary survey, as it suggested earlier. I'm not in any way trying to put this forward as any conclusive, sort of evidence or study at all. But I do think that there is enough information here for us to start a dialogue on this. Now, as I said, speaking with teachers is something that I'm already doing. I'm trying to get a much deeper, grounded understanding of what's happening in the classrooms, and speaking to teachers and teacher educators is something that I'm doing right now. This is something, this is a verbatim quotation from one of the teachers, and only, again, I would sort of want to caution that please don't take it as the end analysis of it. The picture might change, but just to give you a picture of the kind of perception that people have. So the Hindi, the second part is I think will give you an idea. Unfortunately, the translation does not quite capture this thing, but the Hindi original says, "मुझे ये लगता था कि कुछ भी सोचना बड़ा level का सोचना यही दर्शन शास्त्र है." So the equating of my central issue is that, as I've been saying, that they may, yes, I do take it that people have their reasons of why a particular approach is being taken as of now, and they must have, be having a good reason, which I'm sure they do. But what is coming out of that, the end result of it, is probably not in line with what the NCF and NCFT is saying, is my take on it, because the stress that I see in these documents on certain characteristics of the teacher is not something that the philosophy of education is helping them towards in this present form, to the extent that it can, is my argument.
Lots of questions, so can you please? Okay. I have to privilege one over the other. There was another hand that I saw.
In the present syllabi or the unit-wise distribution, it says that you have to study about Mahatma Gandhi, and all the students perceive, or the student teachers perceive, is about what Gandhi has to say about aims of education, curriculum, methods, and strategies like that, and so they just cram about those lines. So they do not have any understanding about what was the philosophy, particularly of Gandhi or Tagore or Arvind or so. So can then you think, do you think that this can be possible that we talk about what should be the aims of education, and then what different philosophers have to say about that, and is it relevant today that what should be the aim? So this kind of arrangement of the content can help in making reflective students.
Yeah. See, aims of education does happen to be, as I had mentioned, one of the most often discussed topic. But they again, talking to teachers, it helps you understand that what they're doing. I mean, when you, so one response which I remember very clearly was that aims of education is a definite question in the question paper. So I said that how would you respond to that, and he says it was in Hindi. It was basically, yeah, हमारे लिए aims of education was, so I'm mixing it, but हमारे लिए aims of education was the same thing as Kothari Commission had said. You see, so aims of education is a topic which I believe lends itself quite well to these things which I'm arguing for, to be able to reason, to be able to, tease out assumptions that a particular person has when he says that a certain thing could be aim of education. But that's not quite happening right now, So the topic in itself might not, you could have the same topic but approached in two different ways. Some of them are, you can be fairly sure that it's more descriptive than anything else. I'm sorry, yeah.
Professor, I wanted to pick up on a comment or two from other questioners and sort of rephrase my thoughts. It strikes me that there's something of a false dichotomy here, but also, which I'll explain in a second, but also it's an issue that plagues courses across schools of education, not just in philosophy of education. And that is that faculty members often teach source material, whether it's Rousseau or Gandhi or Skinner or a course on research design. You tend to do with your students, you do some reading and you focus on what did this author say and what were the conclusions. And when one teaches Rousseau, particularly if you have a crammed syllabus, you tend to focus on what did he say in the meal, and here's some quotes from Rousseau and so on. But one way to resolve the tension between studying great pieces of research or great pieces of educational writing and focusing on how to do it is to do what some of the leading research universities in the US are starting to do, and insist that faculty members, whatever they're teaching, whether it's educational psychology, research design, philosophy of education, should somewhere in a quarter take one of the readings they're set for the class and examine it as a piece of research. How did the writer phrase this question? What are the alternative solutions that the author investigated? What is the form of argument that's used here? Why did the author pick this sort of evidence rather than that sort of evidence? And in that way you're teaching not only to appreciate the work you're looking at, but you're teaching some of these skills, because these skills can't be taught just by lecturing. I'm going to give a lecture today on how to unearth and examine assumptions. The students learn that by working with examining a piece of material, and so you can achieve both things at the same time. But it's very difficult to get faculty members to do this, because when you're running short of time, the easy thing to do is just focus on what the author said, and here are three things that Rousseau said. Now tomorrow we're going to move on to John Dewey.
Can I ask you to allow him a moment to respond? And
I completely agree, and that is in fact one of the ways, as others have also suggested, we can resolve that dichotomy, that it doesn't necessarily have to be either or. One of the things that has also come up when I've been speaking with teachers is that not everybody, and I think this is not just true of India, but perhaps in some of the other countries as well, not all instructors who are teaching philosophy of education courses are, necessarily professionally trained philosophers themselves. Some of the things that people have said is, it becomes a matter of therefore just covering courses and not necessarily looking at some of these skills and so on. So that becomes another added factor. Yes.
I have just, I think, a minute to go. So who is most desperate to ask his question?
That's the last question.
The last question. One last question.
Great. See, what I wanted to say is that teacher, one-year B.Ed course is not the end of making teacher. And therefore, you have to think philosophy of education in a much more, and philosophy of education is taught as a subject of study rather than as a professional do. Secondly, your two sources you are talking about, NCFC and NCE, that teacher education. I don't think they are, by the political nature of that one, they are not sources for inspiration for prime philosophy of education, according to me. Yes, they have drawn from various sources and then they have made a policy document. And this policy document can undergo change. For example, NCERT itself is now talking about separate education schools for minorities, where earlier NCF talked about inclusive education. Therefore, they are transient kind of documents which are used for in a political arena of education. Therefore, but there is a valid this one, and you have to see the.
I must cut you short because it's 10 o'clock.
Yeah, you have to see the NCF in totality rather than only excerpts and quotations. Thank you.
Yeah.
You have to, briefly, can you respond?
Very briefly, yeah. So, is it necessary? As I think you are hinting at, that we take that document as the be all and end all. No, it's not. And here there is an assumption. I'm going with that assumption that these are very important policy documents, and they do. To a large extent guide, the instruction, the syllabi, and what goes on. And that's the reason why I focused on them. But I do take your point that, it's not necessary that you have to take that as the sort of paradigmatic.
Thank you very much, Avinash, for a lucid and a comprehensive presentation.